I used to be someone who felt things deeply: music, colors, touch, words. I remember being 28 and dancing barefoot on warm tiles in the kitchen while Nina Simone played and the rain tapped on the windows like it had something urgent to say. Back then, I wore perfume just because, not because anyone would notice, but because I would. Somewhere along the way, that woman faded like the scent of those old perfumes. I didn't notice when it started, maybe after the third night of putting a child to bed with a fever while my husband worked late again, or the first time I laughed and it sounded hollow in my own ears. Years turned into routines, calendars filled with dentist appointments, grocery runs, muted birthdays, and polite conversations with neighbors who only saw the version of me that smiled on cue. I wasn't unhappy, but I wasn't there. My best friend Angela had always been the mirror that reminded me who I used to be. Loud, loyal, and sun-drenched even in winter, she could walk into a room and make it feel like July. Her house was the one I'd escape to when mine felt too heavy with unspoken things. Over coffee or wine, depending on the hour, we'd talk like girls who hadn't aged at all. I watched her kids grow up in photo frames, in Sunday lunches, in short hugs. That got taller every year. And then one summer evening, he came back, her son, Noah, now 26, back from some art residency in Florence or Madrid or one of those places people go when they still believe in chasing light. I almost didn't recognize him. The last time I'd seen him, he had acne scars and an awkward shuffle. Now he walked like he knew the floor would catch him. Tall, broad-shouldered, his eyes held that kind of stillness people find when they've been alone in beautiful places. He hugged his mother first, lifting her off her feet in that easy, unthinking affection that always makes my chest tighten. When he turned to me, there was a brief flicker of confusion, then recognition. "Miss Helen," he said, and his smile was slow and warm, like sunrise through sheer curtains. His voice had changed. Everything had. I didn't expect to feel seen. Not like that. Not by him. Not by anyone, if I'm honest. I caught my own reflection later in the glass of Angela's patio door, wine glass in hand. My face softened by dusk, and I wondered when I'd stop looking at myself like a person with a story. That night, after I went home and folded laundry, in silence, I caught myself thinking not about the errands I'd forgotten or the emails I needed to send, but about the sound of Noah laughing low, musical, and full of something I couldn't name. And I stood there in the laundry room with a towel pressed to my chest, remembering the last time a man's voice had made me feel anything at all. "Would you like me to continue with part 2 next?" Angela invited me over more often after Noah came home, as if she sensed I needed the noise, the presence of other lives still in motion. Her house always smelled like roasted garlic and sun-dried tomatoes when he was there. He'd picked up cooking abroad, she said with pride, though he brushed it off like it was nothing. I watched him from the kitchen doorway one evening, sleeves rolled up, humming some jazz tune under his breath while he chopped herbs with the ease of someone who had never rushed a single thing in his life. He asked me if I wanted wine, pouring it with a kind of care that felt unnecessary but made my fingers tighten slightly around the stem of the glass. His eyes met mine, then not by accident, but not entirely on purpose either, and held there for a breath longer than politeness required. Conversations with him began to stretch, soft, surprising things that unfolded like linen in sunlight. We talked about books I hadn't mentioned to anyone in years, music I'd nearly forgotten I loved, the way winter always felt lonelier after a beautiful autumn. He listened, not with the detached politeness of someone indulging an older woman, but with the weight of real interest. He asked questions that made me pause. Once he said, "You always pause like you're not sure if you're allowed to speak freely." I didn't know how to answer that. No one had ever noticed before. The way he looked at me didn't carry expectation or awkwardness. It was more dangerous than that. It carried recognition. Like he saw something in me I'd buried under years of careful practicality. He noticed when I changed my hair slightly, when I wore earrings I hadn't touched in ages. Once, he picked up one of my bracelets I'd left on the counter by accident and held it thoughtfully in his hand before saying, "This looks like something someone wild would wear." I didn't know whether to laugh or cry, so I just said, "I used to be wild." He smiled and said softly, "I don't think you ever stopped." It was nothing, no touches, no lines crossed, but the feeling. The feeling grew, uninvited, and quiet like ivy creeping through a window left open. The warmth in my chest when I saw his name pop up in a text. The flutter when his voice hit that soft timbre late at night over tea, when we ended up sitting on the back porch after everyone else had gone to bed. We talked about fear, about time, about the ache of being a little invisible. He said things that didn't belong to a man his age, things that suggested he understood life not just through experience but through empathy. Sometimes I'd find myself smiling at nothing, remembering a joke he'd made, or the way he'd handed me a cup of coffee like it was a small act of devotion. I felt my reflection growing clearer again. I didn't feel young, I felt awake. Would you like me to write part 3 next? It wasn't a grand moment that changed me, no kiss stolen under moonlight, no whispered confessions. It was quieter than that. It was standing in the grocery store, holding a lemon in my hand, and realizing I could taste it just by looking at it. That I'd started noticing flavors again, textures, temperature, music. That something in me had stirred from sleep and was paying attention. I hadn't planned to change. I hadn't meant to feel anything that wasn't simple. But feelings aren't tidy. They arrive uninvited and make themselves comfortable in the corners of your day. The hard part wasn't feeling something for Noah. The hard part was what it reflected back at me, how long I'd gone without feeling anything at all. I started to take walks without a destination. I wore perfume again, a warm amber scent that reminded me of years when people looked at me and saw something vivid. I pulled out the old record player in the garage, the one my husband had once gifted me when we still shared more than silence. I didn't feel guilt. That was the strange thing. I didn't feel disloyal. I felt grief, not over Noah, but over the woman I had abandoned to routine and reliability. She had once been electric, curious, and somehow, without malice, I had dimmed her down to something manageable. Noah remained gentle, present. He never pushed, never hinted. But there were moments heavy with silence, eyes lingering just a beat too long, his voice dropping when he asked if I was happy. He never said what he might have been thinking, and I never asked. I think we both understood that what lived between us wasn't meant to be acted upon. It wasn't about that. It was about awakening, about mirrors, about energy that needed somewhere to go. I began journaling again, something I hadn't done since before the kids were born. The pages filled with things I hadn't had language for, how my chest tightened at the idea of never being seen again, how frightening it was to want more, how I felt too old for dreams and too young to be finished. I didn't tell Angela. I didn't need to. Some truths don't need to be spoken aloud to leave their mark. One morning I watched the sun pour in through my bedroom window, catching dust like gold in the air, and I made a decision. I booked a solo trip, a small coastal town, just me, a suitcase, and a camera I hadn't used in years. I told my family I needed time to think. I told myself I was allowed, not because I owed it to anyone else, but because a part of me had remembered what it meant to be alive. When Noah hugged me goodbye at the airport, he didn't say much, just held me close for a moment longer than necessary. Then he smiled soft, knowing, and said, "I'm glad you remembered yourself," and I whispered, "So am I."